Paolo Cagliari, known as Paolo Veronese, was an Italian Renaissance painter, based in Venice, known for large-format history paintings of religion and mythology, such as The Wedding at Cana and The Feast in the House of Levi Included with Titian, a generation older, and Tintoretto, a decade senior. Veronese of the great trio that dominated Venetian painting of the Cinquecento and the late Renaissance in the 16th century, known as a supreme colorist, and after an early period with Mannerism, Paolo Veronese developed naturalist style of painting influenced by Titian. His most famous works are elaborate narrative cycles, executed in a dramatic and colorful style, full of majestic architectural settings and glittering pageantry. His large paintings of biblical feasts, crowded with figures, painted for the refectories of monasteries in Venice and Verona, are especially famous, and he was also the leading Venetian painter of ceilings. Most of these works remain in situ, or at least in Venice, and his representation in most museums is mainly composed of smaller works such as portraits that do not always show him at his best or most typical. He has always been appreciated for the chromatic brilliance of his palette, the splendor and sensibility of his brushwork, the aristocratic elegance of his figures, and the magnificence of his spectacle. But his work has been felt not to permit expression of the profound, the human, or the sublime, and of the great trio, he has often been the least appreciated by modern criticism. Nonetheless, many of the greatest artists may be counted among his admirers, including Rubens, Watteau, Tiepolo, Delacroix and Renoir. Life and work. Birth and names. Veronese took his usual name from his birthplace of Verona, then the largest possession of Venice on the mainland. The census in Verona attests that Veronese was born sometime in 1528 to a stone cutter, or spezzapreda, named Gabriele, and his wife Caterina. He was the fifth child. It was common for surnames to be taken from a father's profession, and thus Veronese was known as Paolo Spezzapreda. He later changed his name to Paolo Cagliari, because his mother was the illegitimate daughter of a nobleman called Antonio Cagliari. His earliest known painting is signed P. Cagliari F., the first known instance in which he used this surname, and after using Paolo Veronese for several years in Venice, after about 1575 he resumed signing his paintings as Paolo Cagliari. He was often called Paolo Veronese before the last century to distinguish him from another painter from Verona, Alessandro Veronese, now known as Alessandro Turchi. Youth. By 1541, Veronese was apprenticed with Antonio Badal, who was later to become his father-in-law, and in 1544 was an apprentice of Giovanni Francesco Caratuz. Both were leading painters in Verona. An altarpiece painted by Badal in 1543 includes striking passages that were most likely the work of his 15-year-old apprentice. Veronese's precocious gifts soon surpassed the level of the workshop, and by 1544 he was no longer residing with Badal. Although trained in the culture of Mannerism then popular in Parma, he soon developed his own preference for a more radiant palette. In his late teens he painted works for important churches in Verona, and in 1551 he was commissioned by the Venetian branch of the important Giustiniani family to paint the altarpiece for the chapel in the church of San Francesco della Vigna, which was then being entirely rebuilt to the design of Jacopo Sansovino. In the same year he worked on the decoration of the Villa Soranzo near Treviso. with his fellow Veronese Giovanni Battista Zelati and Anselmo Canari. Only fragments of the frescoes remain, but they seem to have been important in establishing his reputation. The description by Carlo Ridolfi nearly a century later mentions that one of the mythological subjects was the family of Darius before Alexander. The rare subject in Veronese's grandest treatment of secular history, now in the National Gallery, London. In 1552, Cardinal Ercole Gonzaga, great-uncle of the ruling Guglielmo Gonzaga, Duke of Mantua, commissioned an altarpiece for Mantua Cathedral, which Veronese painted in situ. He doubtless used his time in Mantua to study the ceilings by Giulio Romano. It was a painter of ceiling frescoes that he would initially make his mark in Venice, where he based himself permanently from the following year. Veronese moved to Venice in 1553 after obtaining his first state commission. Ceilings in fresco decorating the Sala dei Consiglio dei Diocesi in the adjoining Sala dei Tre Capi del Consiglio in the Doge's Palace, in the new rooms replacing those lost in the fire of 1547. His panel of Jupiter expelling the vices for the former is now in the Louvre. He then painted a history of Esther in the ceiling for the Church of San Sebastiano. It was these ceiling paintings and those of 1557 in the Marciana Library that established him as a master among his Venetian contemporaries. Already these works indicate Veronese's mastery in reflecting both the subtle foreshortening of the figures of Correggio and the heroism of those by Michelangelo. Villa Barbaro and Refectory paintings. By 1556 Veronese was commissioned to paint the first of his monumental banquet scenes, the feast in the House of Simon, which would not be concluded until 1570. Owing to its scattered composition and lack of focus, however, it was not his most successful refectory mural. In the late 1550s, during a break in his work for San Sebastiano, Veronese decorated the Villa Barbaro in Mesa, a newly finished building by the architect Andrea Palladio. The frescoes were designed to unite humanistic culture with Christian spirituality. Wall paintings included portraits of the Barbaro family, and the ceilings opened to blue skies and mythological figures. Veronese's decorations employed complex perspective and trompe-l'oeil, and resulted in a luminescent and inspired visual poetry. The encounter between architect and artist was a triumph. The Wedding at Cana, painted in 1562 to 1563, was also collaboration with Palladio. It was commissioned by the Benedictine monks for the San Giorgio Maggiore monastery on a small island across from St. Mark's in Venice. The contract insisted on the huge size, and that the quality of pigment and colors should be of premium quality. For example, the contract specified that the blues should contain the precious mineral lapis lazuli, staged upon a canvas surface nearly 10 meters wide. The scene, taken from the New Testament book of John 2:1-11, represents the first miracle performed by Jesus, the making of wine from water, at a marriage in Cana, Galilee. The foreground celebration, a frieze of figures painted in the most shimmering finery, is flanked by 2 sets of stairs leading back to a terrace, Roman colonnades, and a brilliant sky. In the refectory paintings, as in the family of Darius before Alexander, Veronese arranged the architecture to run mostly parallel to the picture plane, accentuating the processional character of the composition. The artist's decorative genius was to recognize that dramatic perspectival effects would have been tiresome in a living room or chapel, and that the narrative of the picture could best be absorbed as a colorful diversion. These paintings paintings offer little in the representation of emotion, rather, they illustrate the carefully composed movement of the subjects along a primarily horizontal axis. Most of all, they are about the incandescence of light and color. The exaltation of such visual effects may have been a reflection of the artist's personal well-being, for in 1565 Veronese married Elena Bardar, the daughter of his first master, and by whom he would eventually have a daughter and 4 sons. Also painted between 1565 to 70 is his Madonna and Child with St. Elizabeth, the Infant Street, John the Baptist, and Saint Justina in the Timken Museum of Art, San Diego. St. Justina, a patroness of Padua and Venice, is at the right with the Blessed Virgin Mother and the Christ Child in the center. In contrast to Italian works of a century earlier, the infant is rendered convincingly as an infant. What makes one stop and take notice in this painting is the infant's reaching out to Saint Justina, since a baby of this age would normally limit his gaze to his mother. Completing the work is Saint Elizabeth, the cousin of Mary and mother of St. John the Baptist, located on the left. The artist delicately balances the forms of the extended Holy Family and renders them using a superb balance of warm and cool colors. The Feast in the House of Levi. In 1573 Veronese completed the commission for the Feast in the House of Levi, a Last Supper painting for the rear wall of the Refectory at the Basilica di Santi Giovanni e Paolo, Castello, Venice. Originally titled The Last Supper, the painting was to replace a Titian painting burnt in a fire. Veronese's oversized replacement depicted a Last Supper banquet scene that included German soldiers, dwarves, and animals. The human and animal exotic are usual to Veronese's representational narratives. Artistically, the Feast in the House of Levi indicates Veronese's technical development in using intense and luminous colors for texture, attention to narrative coherence, the acute representation of human emotion, and the psychologically subtle interplay occurring among the characters who crowd the scene. Given the subject of the painting, the biblical Last Supper, the humanistic depictions of the characters lacked the piousness usual to Roman Catholic art depicting the Christ character and the events of his life, and the Inquisition readily noticed Veronese's irreligiosity. By the 1570s, the theology of the Counter-Reformation had given legal authority to Roman Catholic doctrine in Venice, which was a new political development for an artist school as Veronese. Professionally, in the Venetian Republic of the late Renaissance, for an artist, painting crowd scenes had acquired political ramifications regarding who and what appeared in a religious painting commissioned from him, regardless of the patron or patroness. A decade earlier, the Benedictine monks who commissioned the wedding at Cana had directed Veronese, as an artist, to freely include as many human figures as would fit in the banquet scene. In contrast, a decade later, Veronese encountered legal, religious constraints that determined the suitability of who and what he depicted in a painting. Thus, on the 18th of July 1573, the Inquisition legally summoned Veronese before a tribunal to explain the presence of what church doctrine considered characters, animals, and in decorum extraneous to an image of the Last Supper of the Christ. The tribunal's interrogation of the painter Veronese was cautionary, rather than punitive, political, rather than judicial. Nonetheless, Veronese explained to the inquisitors that we painters take the same liberties as poets and madmen in telling a story. Although the Inquisition's tribunal ordered Veronese to repaint the Last Supper scene, he opposed the remedy to his theological offenses, yet was compelled to retitle the painting from the sacramental The Last Supper to the Feast in the House of Levi. That an artist, such as Paolo Veronese, had successfully perjured against the Inquisition's implied accusation of heresy, indicated he had the discreet political support of a patrician patron of the arts. Assessment. An artist's biography of Paolo Veronese was included to the second edition of the Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, by Giorgio Vasari, with an improved coverage of the painters of the Florentine school. A fuller biography of Veronese had to await Le Maraviglie dell'arte ovvero La vita degli illustri pittori venetiani and dello Stato, by Carlo Ridolfi, a compilation of the Venetian school painters. Ridolfi said that Veronese's painting of the feast in the House of Levi is by far the most important source for our knowledge of his art, because it gave rein to joy, made beauty majestic, made laughter itself more festive. Moreover, in paintings in the Louvre, Lawrence Gowing's modern assessment of Paolo Veronese's artistic achievement is that the French had no doubts, as the critic Tessifal Gaudio wrote in 1860, that Veronese was the greatest colorist who ever lived, greater than Titian, Rubens, or Rembrandt, because he established the harmony of natural tones in place of the modeling in dark and light that remained the method of academic chiaroscuro. Delacroix wrote that Veronese made light without violent contrasts, which we are always told is impossible, and maintained the strength of hue in shadow. This innovation could not be better described. Veronese's bright outdoor harmonies enlightened and inspired the whole 19th century. He was the foundation of modern painting, but whether his style is in fact naturalistic, as the Impressionists thought, or a most subtle and beautiful imaginative invention must remain a question for each age to answer for itself. Working practices. In addition to the ceiling creations and wall paintings, Veronese also produced altarpieces, paintings on mythological subjects, and portraits. A significant number of compositional sketches in pen, ink and wash, figure studies in chalk, and chiaroscuro modelli and ricordi survive. He headed a family workshop, including his younger brother Benedetto as well as his sons Carlo and Gabriele, and his nephew Luigi Benfatto, that remained active for a decade or so after his death in Venice in 1588, signing the work Herods Pauli, and continuing to use his drawings. According to Nicholas Penny, the role of the workshop seems to have increased steadily, and after 1580 it is rare that we can feel confident that Veronese's was the sole hand involved. Among his pupils were his contemporary Giovanni Battista Zelati and later Giovanni Antonio Fassolo, Sigismondo de Stefani, and Anselmo Canari. The Cagliari family continued, and another Paolo Cagliari published the first monograph on his ancestor in 1888. Veronese was one of the first painters whose drawings were sought by collectors during his lifetime. Selected works. Veronese in popular culture. The Monty Python sketch, The Last Supper, from Monty Python Live at the Hollywood Bowl, is based on the story of Veronese's painting The Feast in the House of Levi. An imaginary Veronese painting called La Morte del Cesare is prominently featured in a story arc of the award-winning comic series 100 Bullets. Veronese in religion. In the Ascended Master Teachings of Elizabeth Clare Prophet, Paolo Veronese is regarded as one of the earthly embodiments of one of the Ascended Masters, a group of beings guiding the spiritual destiny of the planet Earth and its people. Specifically, he is regarded as the Master Paul the Venetian, master of the Third Ray.